So before I dive in, I just want to sort of set the context for open source, because it's pretty much everywhere these days. So, the Android platform, which most smartphones are running on these days, is open sourced. Software developers are using this from specific software houses to, some of the big software integrators are integrating open source software in everything that they're doing. So whether you're a technology lawyer or general commercial lawyer in-house, this is an issue you need to be quite live to, because as I said, the consequences of either not realizing there is open source in something that you're buying in, or there is open source in something that you're licensing out, can have some pretty significant consequences. And I think that the nervousness about open source is largely driven by the fact that there's a bit of a dearth of case law about open source and what the licenses mean, especially in this sort of copyleft restriction that is prevalent in a lot of these restrictive open source licenses, which I'll come to throughout the course of this presentation. But that said, there was one case, well actually it was 5 cases quite recently coming out of the one fact patent called Versata and Ameriprise in the US, which actually looked quite promising in terms of giving some guidance about open source licensing. So I'll touch on that further on in the presentation as it sort of arises in through the issues. But that dealt with both copyright infringement, this concept of copyleft restrictions, but also patent infringements as well. It was a bit unfortunate because most of the cases actually settled, but there was a bit of commentary and a few sort of interim decisions by the judges in Texas that dealt with some of these issues, which have shed some light on how one might interpret open source licenses. So in terms of the agenda, I'll just give a bit of an overview. I know a lot of you here will probably know already quite a bit about open source, but I'll just give a bit of a definition so at least we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. We'll talk about why, or does it matter in the current landscape, and maybe where some of the trends are moving in terms of what type of licenses people are using. Are they using these restrictive or permissive licenses? And we'll go into obviously a bit of detail about the specific issues about both of those. We'll also talk then about the viral infection, which is sort of unfortunately named, but is one of the key concerns when you're using open source software. And then finally, we'll just cover some of the sort of usual warranties and indemnity issues that you need to look out for, both if you're the customer, but also if you're the supplier of open source software. And I'm not sure if anyone here deals with sort of corporate transactions and M&A deals, but if you do, there's a couple of slides at the very end which sort of will take you through a quick canter through some of the issues that you want to be aware of and how you might be able to mitigate the risks in a corporate transaction. So what is open source software? Now, it's I guess the first misconception is that it's not a type of software, it's actually just a form of licensing. So it is defined by sort of distinction to how software is normally licensed, on the sort of traditional proprietary model, which sort of is based on copyright. And obviously the proprietary model is based on the fact that, you have a right to use, I guess, the object code, so you're able to run the software, but it's only that sort of right that you have. You don't usually get any access to the underlying source code, which is really sort of the crown jewels of what the software is, because it shows you how it works and it allows you to manipulate and change that software. So open source software licensing sort of flips that on its head. It makes it, in most cases, compulsory to release not only the object code, which you need to actually run the software, but also also the source code, which is actually the really valuable part of the software, and that obviously allows you to modify it, make changes, integrate it quite easily with your own products without necessarily having to go back to the original software creator. And it does this by effectively flipping copyright on its head, and this is sort of one of the key distinguishing features of open source, and that's why they call it copyleft instead of copyright in respect of these certain restrictions, because what they do is they use the licensing model to compel you to, one, make sure you release the source code if you're actually distributing the software onwards from your original license, and also make sure that whatever terms you took the software on, the original open source license, you actually on license on exactly those same terms, and that way it just perpetuates this cycle, and also ensures that obviously the source code is always open for other people to use. Open source is also just generally embodied by 4 freedoms: the freedom just to run the software how you want, the freedom to study it, which is where you need the access to the source code, the freedom to adapt and improve the software, and also to distribute it to whoever you want. Now, there's a bit of a, I guess there's a slight shift in the market these days. Like a while ago, probably about 5 years ago, these sort of restrictive licenses were really prevalent and probably made up about 50% of the open source licensing market. And that I think has shifted quite a bit these days. And what we've seen now is that that market has shrunk a little bit for the restrictive licenses, and the permissive licenses, which don't have this copyleft concept, which is one of the main issues, is becoming more and more prevalent. So, as I mentioned before, the Android platform is an open source platform, and that's licensed on the Apache 2 license, which is this permissive license. And that's sort of based on the fact that they want to encourage openness, but unlike these restrictive licenses, they don't want to force openness on everyone. So they say, look, we will distribute the source code and you can do with it what you want, but what we won't do is force you then to on-distribute it and release the source code as well. So it gives you the freedom of choice. And I guess the best analogy for me is, I come from Australia where we have a voting system where you have to vote, and if you don't vote you get fined, versus here where you have the right to vote but you don't have to vote, and it's sort of a similar thing here. Be alert but not alarmed. I guess this is sort of one of the messages with open source. Especially for people who aren't that familiar with it, as soon as you see it, you get quite concerned. Does this mean that everything that the open source touches needs to be released? Is this going to cripple the whole business? Is it going to affect, our revenue generating technology and systems? And as I said before, one of the other sort of reasons why a lot of people are quite concerned about open source is not only the fact that there hasn't been a lot of judicial testing of open source licenses, but it's also because most of them haven't been drafted by lawyers. They've been drafted by, programmers who want to license on these terms. And so the terms they use are sometimes uncertain. Most of them don't have a governing law clause. So then you have to ask, how will it be interpreted? So these things all add to, I guess, some of the concerns about open source generally. Just as before we get into some of these issues in a bit more detail, I wanted to give you some of the sort of the headline concerns that I guess you should always ask yourself as soon as you come across an open source license. And the main takeaway is really, that goes through all of these, is really how is it being used, because that actually will dictate, together with what the actual open source license is, the things that you need to be concerned about. If you're using it just internally within your organisation, like let's say it's running your internal accounting function, so it's not client-facing, it's not in any of your products that you're distributing or trying to license to clients, then the risks that you might face and need to address will be very, very different to the fact that you might be then, or to a different scenario where you're actually using open source software in your products that you're licensing to clients. So you then trigger this distribution or conveying trigger, which then has certain consequences, which I'll come to. So despite the sort of lack of case law, this case that I did mention, Versata and Ameriprise, is really relevant in the sense that this was exactly one of these cases where the parties actually, or one of the parties, Versata, who was the original software developer, they created this software distribution channel tool, which was used by, or licensed to Ameriprise. They had a series of independent financial advisors, and they needed this tool to be able to, help manage those financial advisors. And Versata thought that their software was entirely proprietary. They thought that it was created entirely by them internally from scratch, and so they licensed it on a proprietary model. Ameriprise then got Infosys involved to do some modifications and development work for them so they could modify the tool and use it in a slightly different way, which Versata then brought a claim against them for saying, look, that was a use outside the scope of the license. And the motivation for that was Versata had another cloud-based product which was obviously more expensive, and they wanted Ameriprise to move across to that. But it all sort of unravelled because during the sort of discovery phase, Ameriprise found that actually part of the key software that Versata was licensing was actually open source and was licensed under the GNU GPL version 2, which is one of the most restrictive open source licenses around. So then they brought a counterclaim against them to say, actually, you've got an obligation to release all of the source code, and because of this viral infection that I'll come to in a bit more detail, actually we then have the right, because it's licensed under this open source license, to modify the software ourselves. And so actually what we've done with it isn't an infringement of our license. And you would think that's where it ended, but it didn't, because actually what happened there was the actual original creator of that of the element of open source code was another company called Simpleware. And so they actually owned that original bit of code that was open sourced. So then they brought a claim against both Ameriwise and Versata for patent infringement and for breach of the license terms. It started going through the litigation process in Texas. And so there were these 5 claims, one against Infosys, and then a couple in relation to between Ameriprise and Versata, and then the 2 sort of patent-related claims from Simpleware against both Versata and Ameriwise. And so the Simpleware patent claims both settled, and there wasn't too much that actually came out of that. The case against Infosys was also dismissed, so there wasn't a lot of information or a lot of sort of precedent that came out of that with sort of any particular relevance to the open source licensing issue. But the 2 cases that did focus on this copyleft issue did go through the courts, and it was looking, and there was a little bit of commentary on this, that it was looking quite promising, and it was going to be one of the few cases where the courts might actually look at how these open source licenses worked and where that obligation does arise from for you to then distribute your own source code if it has been infected by the open source. But unfortunately, that also settled, so there wasn't a final judgment on that we can draw on. But the one thing that I guess it does teach us is that open source, because it's becoming so much more prevalent, is something that you really need to be aware of. So it is becoming more prevalent. The stakes are a lot higher because people are using it for business critical systems now. So the incentive to bring a claim and see it through to litigation is increasing. So I think, although there were a couple of cases through the 90s on open source, we may see a bit of an increase now and hopefully get a bit more certainty as to how these open source licenses are meant to work. Now, to get into some of the nuts and bolts of these open source licenses into a bit more detail, I've just extracted a couple of provisions from each of the open source licenses on the screen. So the GNU GPL version 2 is the one that I was referring to before, and this is the most common open source license that you'll see. And the part that I put up there is this copyleft provision. And so here it's quite clear that if you want to distribute the open source software that you've got, so it doesn't matter if you're just using it internally, this won't apply, but if you're using it and you want to distribute it or license it to someone, then that's when this provision comes into play. So if you distribute something that is even partly based on the original open source license, it compels you to license the entire software, so not only the open source part, but even your own proprietary work on the same terms as the open source license, which means you have to disclose all the source code. And obviously, most companies don't want to do that because they lose their competitive advantage. Other people can start replicating potentially or see how the software works. In contrast to that is this Apache version 2 license, which is probably the second or third most used license around at the moment in the open source world. And this is one of these permissive licenses. So it has this definition of derivative works, where if you do use some of the open source code and derive a new work from it, there are certain provisions that apply. But it doesn't have this obligation to release it. You can release your source code with it. The main obligation, they say, is if you have a derived work and you want to distribute it, you just need to ensure that you include a copyright notice and certain disclaimers, whether it's usually the warranties as to IPR infringement and things like that. And also just put some copyright acknowledgements on it. So they're fairly sort of low maintenance requirements. So you can see there's quite a big difference, and this is why I think there's been a real movement towards having people use permissive licenses rather than these restrictive licenses like the GPL. So we've talked a bit about the viral effect of restrictive licenses. One of the key things about open source software is, whether you're a coder or not, you really need to get into the detail of what is actually happening with the software. So you need to speak to the technical people on the ground, because some of the issues that are relevant are how the code is put together. And sometimes you can do this by what's known as statically or dynamically linking to libraries. And they have quite different consequences. So if it's a static link, so effectively what a library is a set of code that is sort of out there that a lot of people can access, and you can create and integrate into your own code in a way that you don't have to rewrite it. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And if that's statically linked, i.e. it's already embedded in the source code that you're also writing, that is generally seen then as being part or integrated with the actual source code, and that will then have the viral effect. Whereas you can dynamically link to these libraries as well, which means the library's out there, you don't actually pull the code into your into your program, you just link to it. So when you need it, it calls to it. So it's sort of like how an API works, if people are familiar with that concept. And the library is always held separately, and there's a pretty good argument that if you're linking to like an open source product dynamically, that won't infect your proprietary code, so you won't have these issues about the viral effect. And it is this sort of derivative works that you have to license under the original terms and release all the source code, which is what is this copyleft concept. In contrast, the permissive licenses we've talked about not having a viral effect. You just need to include a copyright notice and disclaimer of certain warranties. And also, like the Apache license, you'll see down the bottom, it does actually allow you to change the license terms so it doesn't have that restrictive effect on you as well. So this is a very crude pictorial diagram, which I've lifted from Toby, so I shouldn't say it's that crude, but it sort of helps illustrate this concept. So in the first line, your code is the parts in green. You may have pulled in some open source codes. If that's governed by one of these copyleft or restrictive licenses, you can see that the open source components are very much integrated into the overall line of code, and that pretty much means it's been infected and you will have to release all of that source code. The second example is harder to say, and this again is where you really do need to understand how it's been put together. Sometimes you can have your code sitting side by side with open source code in a way that doesn't cause this viral effect. And the easiest way, I guess, to really tell is you need to ask yourself, when you hit run on the code, i.e. when it gets compiled and executed, is it done as one file or as two separate files? And if it's two separate files, generally, you're going to be okay because they can be seen as two separate works. If they have to run together in one sort of execution action, then it's arguable that it's more likely to have been infected. Obviously, I'm not a computer programmer, but so these are the types of questions you need to be asking to get a real sense of, is there an issue? And then the third example is where there's probably not going to be any infection, and this is where there is either these types of dynamic links or the codes are quite separate and maybe call out to another through an API or some other widget. We've touched on some of these risks and some of the mitigations. The main one with the viral infection is, I guess, know what you're doing, or get your developers to tell you what they're doing, and consider when you're engaging with software integration houses or people doing any coding for you to have some warranties in there or some obligations that they don't use any open source code which is subject to a restrictive license, because that's where you're going to get into some trouble. There's obviously the general compliance obligation under almost every open source license, which is just include notices. There's no real mitigation to that other than just make sure you include them. IPR claims, and whether under an indemnity or a warranty, are quite important. So from a customer's perspective, what you have to realise is that with open source, they generally don't come with any warranties or indemnities. So you have to just take the software as is and take the comfort that there actually haven't been that many actions under any open source license, and maybe you get comfortable with it that way. Or maybe you feel there are bigger organisations out there using this open source as well, so if someone's going to be sued, it's probably not going to be me. But from a supplier's perspective, what we see on a lot of deals, especially on a lot of sort of the bigger integration deals where a supplier is using its own code, creating things from scratch and incorporating some open source code, they'll be giving absolute warranties and indemnities against non-infringement. So they say, the deliverables that we give you won't infringe the IPR of a third party. And that's obviously quite problematic, because what you'd ordinarily do if you're getting third-party code in is back it out with your subcontractor who's helping you create it. And that's obviously not possible to do in an open source context, because generally the original licensor is not giving you any warranties or indemnities. So it's just something to watch out for. But the other way you can mitigate this is by engaging with certain organisations, like Red Hat is one of the ones that I've mentioned there, which is an open source supplier really. So they sometimes create some software, but they provide a lot of services around open source software. So provide maintenance and support, and they also for a fee can sometimes provide you with warranty or indemnity protection. So it is an option out there if you find that you are using open source, you're not getting any love from your supplier because they're not giving you any protection. You do have some third-party options there. The last point on this table that I wanted to touch on was open source in the cloud. So we get quite a lot of questions these days about, does open source matter if the solution is cloud-based, if it's delivered as a service, like as a SaaS solution? And the answer again is you really need to understand how it's delivered. So in a pure software as a service model, the actual code will be hosted on a server held by the supplier, and you'll just be accessing it through a web browser or something like that. And in most cases, or in that case where there's no actual software being delivered to you, the risk of infringement or there being an issue with open source is actually very, very low. But what I think a lot of people don't realise is that in a lot of SaaS solutions, including like Microsoft 365, it doesn't work exactly like that. So to enable you to access the cloud-based solution, what you will sometimes have to do is install like a thin client agent on your own server or on your own laptop. And so obviously if that contains any open source code, then you need to be thinking about exactly the same issues as if you were just installing it entirely on your own. So again, it's very important to understand what the licenses are, but especially in the cloud context, is there a requirement that actually there is some source code or some object code that you need to run on your own system, so you're not just accessing it through a web portal. And that again is only a question that most of the tech guys can answer. And just the myth and truth down there I'll come to later, because that's largely involved on the corporate transactions. So from a practical perspective, this is just a bit of a sort of high-level summary is the things you should be asking. Know what open source you're using and what licenses they come under, and this can be audited. So there are organisations out there like Black Duck that can run another computer program over your entire system to help identify whether or not there's any open source code in the code that's been delivered to you. Know the origin of the source. We were doing a deal recently for a healthcare or someone in the healthcare sector where they were creating or wanting to use a data management platform, and the person providing it, he was proposing to use a lot of the code in it as an open source, as under an open source license. But because they knew that they had created it from scratch, albeit licensing it under an open source model, they could get a bit more comfortable about the fact that they weren't getting an IPR indemnity in relation to copyright infringement, because they at least had the comfort that it hasn't gone through several hands and several iterations, that it's coming fresh from the person, which is why it's sort of quite important to know who was the original creator of the code and how sort of many iterations it's got to before it's got to you. Know how it's being used with your organisation, because as I said, that sort of technical aspect is really the most important, because the considerations can be vastly different if you're just using it internally versus in a product that you're actually licensing on to everyone else. And don't forget about the compliance aspect. There are these copyright notices that you have to flow down that you'll need to tell your programmers to include in sort of the text files. This is just a bit more detail in relation to some of the questions that you should be asking, but you can flick through those in your pack at your leisure, or I'm happy to take questions on them afterwards if you like. The last topic I was just wanting to cover for anyone that does have to look at open source in the context of a corporate transaction is sort of what is the main issue, and it is that headline issue. Is the company you're buying, especially if it's a tech company, will its ability to generate revenue be dependent on some form of open source software? And that's the main question that's going to drive the other questions or actions that you need to take. It is one of the biggest issues that a lot of people will face in a corporate transaction, especially on that sort of IP, IT side. And it can take a long time because of sort of the technical nature of it to get to the bottom of. So it's something you want to try to identify early. And these are the types of questions you want to be asking. Firstly, do they use open source? If they do, how are they using it? What licenses are they granted under? Those issues about, was it the first one? Is it integrated with other proprietary code? And that ownership question about, how long along the iteration line is this open source software? And if you as you get through those questions, it should bear out some responses to RFIs, and you just need to keep drilling down until you really have a real understanding of what the source code that is open source is, how relevant is it, and what sort of guarantees can they give you about where it's come from and how it's being used. Obviously, you can then put in some specific warranties or potentially indemnity protection in relation to any open source use. If you can't get that, look for things like increased liability caps, either in respect of open source breaches or a general IPR indemnity. And other than that, those are really the key ways in which you can mitigate the risk in that sort of corporate context.